Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. To all our amazing subscribers, thank you for tuning in tonight. Your incredible support means the world to us. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button because we share powerful life-changing stories every single week. Tonight we dive into a deeply moving story about boundaries, hidden truths, and what happens when the people who are supposed to love you the most try to keep you small. Let's begin. My name is Chloe Vance. I am 32 years old, and the night my father looked me in the eye and called me uneducated trash, I didn't shed a single tear, I didn't beg for his understanding, and I didn't utter a word in my own defense. I simply stood there, frozen at the head of his 60th birthday dinner table. Around me, the rest of my family turned to stone, staring into their plates as he spat insults at me like I was a stain he desperately wanted scrubbed off his hardwood floors. He told me I was a lowlife hustler. He told me that whatever money I managed to scrape together online would never buy me a seat at a respectable table. He pointed his finger at the front door and commanded me to get out of his house. The profound irony was staggering. For nearly a decade, I had been quietly keeping that exact family afloat, secretly funding emergencies they never even realized I had paid for. By that night, I had built an independent enterprise valued at $31 million. But in that dining room, wrapped in their suffocating judgments, none of that mattered. To them, I was still the broken variable, the disappointing daughter who dropped out of college, ruined their perfect family script, and chose a path they couldn't control. So I looked my father dead in the eyes, adjusted my coat and said, "Okay, fine." I picked up my purse and walked out into the chilly autumn night without once raising my voice. I was gone before anyone could summon the courage to stop me. By sunrise, I had packed my entire life into cardboard boxes, turned my phone face down on the passenger seat, and left Columbus, Ohio, in my rearview mirror without saying a single goodbye. What my family didn't know was that exactly 3 weeks later, the very people who watched me get thrown out like garbage would be choking on a truth they had spent years mocking. For the first time in my life, I was finally going to breathe without waiting for their permission. Before I reveal the staggering secret my brother uncovered 3 weeks later, and the absolute chaos that erupted when I disappeared without a word, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment below with your local time, your city, and where you are watching this from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels tonight. I grew up in a meticulously curated suburb of Columbus, in a household where personal achievement only possessed value if it came wrapped in a traditional institutional bow. My father, Arthur Vance, was a rigid mechanical engineer who spent 35 years climbing the ladder at the same legacy industrial firm. He treated his corporate longevity not just as a career, but as absolute proof of his moral and intellectual superiority. My mother, Martha, was a middle school history teacher. She possessed a much softer voice, but she enforced my father's strict social doctrines with a gentle smile instead of a shout. Then there were my siblings. My older brother, Julian, followed corporate formulas the way some people follow fundamentalist religions. My sister, Clara, learned at a very young age exactly what to say, which rooms to say it in, and how to make adults praise her for her remarkable maturity. And then there was me. I was the glitch in their perfect matrix. I was the child who made everyone deeply uncomfortable. At age 10, while Clara was playing dress-up, I was converting our garage into a makeshift weekend market. I would find discarded wooden stools, repaint them in vibrant colors, bundle thrift store porcelain sets together, and convince neighbors to buy them at a premium. Why? Because I attached handwritten tags to each item, transforming a chipped bowl from damaged goods into a piece of living history. At age 13, I was charging local boutique crafters small fees to properly photograph and style their inventories so they could launch basic online storefronts. At age 16, I was building custom digital checkout pages for women selling embroidered linens and organic soaps at regional country fairs. I was entirely captivated by human behavior. I wanted to understand exactly how people made purchasing decisions, why a compelling narrative sold infinitely better than a technical specification sheet, and how aesthetic presentation altered perceived value. My father dismissed all of it. He would look at my notebooks and call them cute little internet hustles, patting me on the head before tuning me out completely. He used to stand in the kitchen after dinner, nursing his coffee, lecturing me that cleverness without a university credential was nothing more than a hobby with expensive lighting. My mother would quietly interject, claiming he only wanted financial security for me. But I knew what she really meant. She wanted obedience. When Julian secured a summer internship at a corporate bank, the family celebrated with an expensive steak dinner. When Clara brought home top marks in her pre-law tracks, my parents spent an hour calling our grandparents to brag. But when I earned enough money at 17 to completely pay for my own car insurance and purchase a professional-grade laptop in cash, my father barely blossomed into interest. He barely bothered to look up from his newspaper. He simply sighed and said, "That frantic energy would be a whole lot more impressive, Chloe, if you aimed it at a real future." I eventually enrolled at Ohio State University solely because fighting their constant disapproval felt far more exhausting than disappointing myself. I lasted exactly 3 semesters. Every lecture felt like listening to someone describe the ocean through a dirty window, while I was already out at sea, fighting the waves. Professors lectured about theoretical risk using outdated slideshows. Meanwhile, I was already managing real operational risks in the real world. I wasn't lazy, I was profoundly misaligned. But in the Vance household, there was no distinction between nonconformity and failure. The afternoon I sat my father down and told him I was officially withdrawing from university. His face hardened into an expression of pure disgust. He didn't ask what I intended to build. He didn't ask about my vision. He looked at me like a judge presiding over a criminal trial and asked what kind of public humiliation I intended to bring upon this family. He told me I was choosing a life of financial struggle because I was simply too arrogant to accept institutional structure. He asserted that no respectable, serious business professional would ever trust a college dropout with real capital or real executive responsibility. My mother openly wept, not because she feared for my financial survival, but because she was terrified of what the neighbors would whisper at church. Julian laughed in my face, telling me my little internet experiments would dry up the moment a real recession hit. Clara told me I was romanticizing instability because I desperately wanted special treatment for being quirky. But I walked away anyway. I rented a cramped, dimly lit studio apartment directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat on the east side of the city. I worked until my wrists throbbed with carpal tunnel syndrome. I taught myself the brutal, unglamorous underbelly of digital commerce. International shipping logistics, credit card chargebacks, ad creative fatigue, unit economic margins, and handling client supply emergencies at 2 o'clock in the morning. And do you know what cut the deepest during those grueling broke years? It wasn't the fact that I was eating instant noodles to afford server costs. It was the crushing realization that my own family would have genuinely preferred to see me miserable in a traditional, respectable career path, rather than thriving and brave in a world they couldn't comprehend. Have you ever felt like the people who claimed they were trying to protect you were actually just trying to bury the version of you they couldn't control? Let me know in the comments. But keep watching because everything changed when the business finally exploded, and the family's financial secrets started catching up to them. The venture that ultimately transformed my life didn't materialize as a sudden poetic stroke of genius. It was forged from years of watching exceptionally talented artisans, makers, and small manufacturers fail. They could create beautiful, high-quality physical products, but they possessed zero technological infrastructure, no data-driven pricing strategies, no scalable fulfillment networks, and no one teaching them how to scale their operations without losing their souls to predatory online marketplaces. I spent my early 20s filling that precise vacuum. I built specialized e-commerce pipelines, negotiated massive volume shipping discounts with freight carriers, photographed products on borrowed backdrops, and literally slept on a mattress squeeze between towers of inventory because I couldn't afford a commercial warehouse lease yet. When I turned 23, I met my ultimate mentor, Sofia Rodriguez, at a regional trade exposition in Louisville. I was exhausted, stressed, and trying desperately not to look entirely out of my depth. Sofia had spent 25 years as a chief operating buyer for major boutique retail chains. Within 10 minutes of looking at my operational spreadsheets, she saw what my family had spent over a decade refusing to acknowledge. She looked at me and said, "Chloe, you aren't scattered. You are highly commercial. And you aren't unserious. You are just early." Sofia helped me transition from a frantic freelancer into a calculated corporate operator. Together, we structured my work into a comprehensive ecosystem. A premium commerce, technology, and logistics firm designed exclusively to help independent American home goods manufacturers, textile artists, and specialty brands scale multi-million-dollar direct-to-consumer operations. It nearly destroyed me multiple times. I maxed out a massive commercial credit line during a supply chain bottleneck and had to work 18-hour days for 6 brutal months to pay it off. I lost an entire holiday Q4 season to a devastating ocean freight issue that wiped out my yearly profit margins. I spent one entire winter working in my office wearing heavy winter gloves indoors because I deliberately chose to route cash flow to employee payroll rather than turning on the building's heating system. But every single trauma taught me an operational lesson that no elite university syllabus could ever replicate. My lessons didn't come with grades. They came with legal invoices, chronic insomnia, and total accountability. By the time I hit 28, my firm occupied a beautiful corporate headquarters, employed 41 full-time team members, managed national distribution hubs, and ran proprietary software tools that industry analysts desperately tried to categorize because they couldn't grasp how deeply our value was rooted in the back-end logistics. By 30, I had calmly turned down 2 massive acquisition buyout offers because I valued operational independence far more than a vanity tech headline. And by 32, my personal equity distributions had made me a wealthy woman, with $31 million resting securely in my private accounts. Yet, I still never disclosed the true numbers to my parents or siblings. I kept telling myself I was doing it to protect the fragile equilibrium of our relationship. But if I am being completely honest with myself now, the truth was far uglier. A wounded, childish part of me still desperately wanted them to love me and validate me before my wealth made me undeniable. I wanted them to see me, not my bank account. So, I deliberately continued to show up small in rooms where I was actually carrying the heaviest financial burdens. When my mother required an intensive medical procedure, and her insurance company stalled on a massive chunk of the hospital invoice, a private legal trust suddenly stepped in and seamlessly resolved the entire balance. My mother thought it was an administrative miracle. It wasn't. It was me. When Julian came up drastically short on his down payment for his suburban home, an anonymous real estate investment fund stepped in through a mutual family connection to provide the exact liquidity he needed. He thought he was a financial genius who negotiated a great deal. It was my money. When Clara's extravagant wedding came within days of collapsing because vendor inflation costs suddenly doubled, the financial shortfall magically vanished before she ever had to experience the public embarrassment of downsizing. She assumed our parents found the money. They hadn't. I paid the invoices directly. My father once sat at Sunday dinner, puffed out his chest, and declared himself the unshakable backbone of the Vance family, completely oblivious to the fact that he was currently driving a luxury SUV that I had secretly paid to mechanically refurbish the week prior. That was the bizarre, painful silence I lived in. I would deploy millions of dollars to rescue them from their structural collapses at noon, and then sit at their dinner table at 6 o'clock to be lectured as the family's cautionary tale. The absolute breaking point occurred during a summer barbecue. Julian casually mentioned that he was thinking about launching a boutique consulting side hustle to advise local real estate contractors on commercial property financing. Recognizing the operational flaws in his logic, I gently offered to sit down with him and show him how to architect modern digital lead funnels and automated client nurture systems that actually generated conversions. Julian smirked, took a sip of his beer, and condescendingly said, "Thanks, Chloe, but I think I'm going to take my business advice from professionals who actually finished college, rather than someone who just got lucky selling trendy trinkets on the internet." My father actually nodded in agreement, adding, "A university degree teaches structural discipline, son. That will always matter infinitely more than internet hustle." I remember forced smiling through that entire afternoon as if the words didn't cut me to the bone. By that point, I was a master at swallowing humiliation whole. But keeping that kind of silence for years does something profoundly dangerous to your psyche. It slowly hardens into emotional distance, then into quiet resentment, and eventually into terrifying clarity. I had spent years telling myself that my restraint was an act of love. I told myself that taking the high road was the ultimate sign of dignity. I was completely wrong. My silence wasn't healing my family. It was simply making their disrespect incredibly cheap for them to purchase. And then my father's 60th birthday arrived. I made the catastrophic mistake of believing that a truth finally spoken plainly, with total generosity, would change the hearts of the people who raised me. What happens when the gift she presents completely shatters the family's reality? Stay tuned because the next scene at the dinner table changes everything permanently. I arrived at my father's milestone birthday dinner carrying an envelope containing a meticulously structured gift. I had spent months coordinating it with my executive financial and legal teams. It wasn't designed to be flashy, and it certainly wasn't an act of calculated revenge. It was a completely pre-funded, ironclad retirement package that guaranteed my parents would never have to worry about future medical surprises, market crashes, or the suffocating corporate anxiety my father wore like a badge of honor. But tucked deep inside that gesture was a private, incredibly vulnerable hope that I am almost embarrassed to acknowledge now. I genuinely believed that if I showed them what I had actually achieved, calmly, factually, without any theatrical bravado, they might finally see the real Chloe. Not the rebellious 19-year-old dropout, but the accomplished woman standing right in front of them. The evening commenced exactly the way family humiliations always do, with everyone behaving just normal enough to make you question your own self-protective instincts. My mother spent the first hour fussing endlessly over the roast. Clara talked loudly about a high-profile corporate case her legal firm had recently settled. Julian spent the night aggressively inserting complex investment jargon into ordinary conversations because he desperately wanted to sound expensive. My father sat regally at the head of the table, basking in the absolute, unchallenged authority that only survives if nobody in the room possesses the courage to challenge the narrative. No one asked me a single meaningful question. Not about my company, not about my life, not about why I looked sharper, more composed, and entirely distinct from the girl they used to lecture. I waited patiently until the dessert plates were cleared. Then, I gently slid the elegant envelope next to my father's wine glass and softly stated that I wanted to share something meaningful for his milestone year. Arthur opened the envelope slowly, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the sophisticated corporate letterhead and the substantial financial figures detailed within. He looked up, a deep frown carving into his forehead, and coldly asked what exactly he was looking at. I explained as clearly and modestly as possible that my logistics enterprise had just crossed an extraordinary national valuation milestone. I told him that I had leveraged my corporate structuring to permanently secure their retirement future, because I loved them and wanted them to live without operational stress. The dining room descended into a suffocating dead silence. Julian was the first to break it, releasing a harsh, cynical laugh. He asked if this was one of those classic fake internet wealth illusions where people flex paper valuations and lease sports cars to manipulate social media algorithms. Clara rolled her eyes, sighing heavily. Chloe, please. Do you really have to hijack Dad's entire 60th birthday dinner to promote your personal brand? My father stared down at the legal guarantees as if the documents were a personal insult to his entire 35-year career. A thin, venomous disgust crept into his voice as he asked whether I truly believed that throwing millions of unearned internet dollars around made me equal to people who had actually sacrificed and done life the right, disciplined way. I felt something fracture inside me. I calmly said, Dad, this has absolutely nothing to do with equality. It is an act of care. I have been quietly covering this family's structural shortfalls for years because I never wanted any of you to feel financially exposed. That was the exact moment the room completely detonated. My mother blinked, looking utterly disoriented. Julian's face instantly drained of color, transitioning from smug condescension to absolute rage. Clara slammed her fork down, aggressively demanding to know exactly what I was implying. I should have stopped. My logical brain told me to walk away. But the dam had completely broken. The old, deeply buried wounds tore wide open, and the truth poured out. I mean, I said, my voice steady but freezing cold, that I am the one who privately wired the funds to settle Mom's medical balances when the insurance company walked away. I am the anonymous real estate partner who provided the capital liquidity Julian desperately needed to close on his house. And I am the person who quietly paid off Clara's wedding venue shortfalls when the event was 48 hours away from being cancelled. I didn't say it to mock them. I didn't say it to humiliate them. I said it because I was completely exhausted by the lies, and I wanted the objective truth to finally exist in the room we all occupied. My father stood up so violently that his heavy wooden chair screamed against the dining room floor. He didn't look relieved. He didn't look grateful. He looked like a cornered, desperate animal. That was the exact second I realized a profound psychological truth. Some people would genuinely rather call you cruel or manipulative than admit they actually needed your strength to survive. "Do you honestly think," Julian snarled, his voice trembling with humiliated rage, "that your money makes us some kind of pathetic charity case?" "You are incredibly manipulative, Chloe," Clara chimed in, her eyes flashing with anger. "Holding these financial secrets over our heads just to stage a dramatic reveal when you feel slighted?" My mother buried her face in her hands, weeping softly, repeating that she didn't understand why I would ever do these things in total secrecy, as if the glaring reason wasn't sitting right at the head of the table, furious that his illusion of total provider dominance had just been dismantled. Then my father started shouting. The sheer volume of his voice shook the room. He screamed that I had walked into his home with the sole intention of buying authority. He yelled that money generated by a college dropout would never impress him, and that I had absolutely no right to make people with real, hard-earned educations feel small at their own family table. Julian and Clara joined the chorus, viciously mocking my logistics enterprise, calling it a fluke, an uncredentialed internet bubble that embarrassed the family by association. Throughout the entire onslaught, I kept my composure. My absolute lack of an emotional reaction seemed to enrage my father even more. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the front door. "You are nothing but uneducated trash with good timing," he roared, his face flushed purple. "Get out of my house, you lowlife. And don't you dare ever come back here acting like your money makes you one of us." One of us. As if they had ever truly allowed me to belong. I remember picking up my leather purse. I distinctly remember my hands being completely steady, even though my chest felt entirely hollowed out, as if a hand had reached in and scooped out my ribs. I turned and looked at each of their faces one final time. My mother refused to look up from the tablecloth. Clara's expression had shifted into a flicker of sudden shame, but she remained completely silent. Julian looked intensely pleased, as if an ugly, deeply nurtured jealousy in his soul had finally won a massive victory. And my father stood rigid, breathing heavily, waiting for me to cry or scream. I simply looked at him and said, "Okay, fine." That was it. No grand speech, no tears, no desperate begging for someone in that room to step up and defend my character. I turned my back, walked down the long hallway, and exited the house. I sat in the driver's seat of my car for nearly 2 full minutes without starting the engine. I didn't cry. I just stared blankly through the windshield into the dark suburban night, and felt something profound happen inside my psyche. It felt like dry ice, cold, clean, and completely absolute. I wasn't broken. I was finished. By the time I pulled away from the curb, the decision was already concrete. I was never going to spend another single second of my life auditioning for love and basic respect in a family that only valued me when I was small enough for them to manage. I drove straight back to my condo, packed my essentials into boxes until the sun crested the horizon, completely deleted the family group chat from my phone, left my house key resting on the kitchen counter, and by sunrise I hit the highway heading south toward Savannah, Georgia. I didn't send an explanatory letter. I didn't leave a trail. 3 weeks later, they would finally realize that my sudden silence wasn't a sign of weakness or retreat. It was the sound of a heavy steel vault locking permanently from the inside. But the story doesn't end in exile. Wait until you hear what happened when my brother Julian tracked me down in Savannah 3 weeks later, completely unaware of the trap he was walking into. Keep watching. Savannah did not magically heal my emotional wounds overnight, but it gave me something infinitely more valuable: the spaciousness required to stop performing. I had quietly purchased a beautifully restored, historic coastal cottage near the water the year prior as an independent corporate investment, a place I had vaguely told myself I might use decades down the road when my life felt less crowded. I arrived at its gates with boxes, pure exhaustion, and an internal fury so clinical and controlled it almost felt elegant. The very first thing I did was ruthlessly strip the property of anything that looked temporary or borrowed. I took down the generic commercial artwork. I unpacked stunning, hand-carved furniture and custom textiles crafted by the independent makers I had spent years partnering with. I filled my kitchen with physical objects built by people who constructed tangible things with their bare hands, rather than people who constructed loud opinions with their mouths. Then I executed a small, highly symbolic ritual. I completely wiped every single family photograph from my digital devices. I took a cardboard box filled with old, performative birthday cards and high school graduation notes, placed it into a metal fire pit in the backyard, and watched it burn to ash. I didn't do it out of raw hatred. I did it because I desperately required the physical ritual. I needed a tangible visual marker that declared that specific desperate version of Chloe Vance was officially dead. Within a week, the chronic tension left my shoulders. I started sleeping deeply through the night for the first time in years. I walked along the coast before the sun rose. I adopted a massive half-blind rescue dog with a torn left ear and named him Cooper. I leased a beautiful sunlit brick studio downtown where I began hosting small, intimate operational workshops for independent female founders and makers building consumer brands outside the traditional, gate-kept corporate pathways. The first workshop was structurally designed for 12 people. 47 showed up. Some came because they desperately needed advanced logistics strategy, but many came because they had been explicitly told by the people who raised them that their ambitions were unrealistic, and they no longer trusted the voice of their own intuition. I recognized every single face in that room. I knew their pain intimately. And then, on a wildly humid Saturday afternoon exactly 3 weeks after my departure from Columbus, Julian appeared on my front porch. He was wearing that exact same arrogant, superior expression he always wore whenever he believed he could weaponize familiar charm into operational leverage. But as I looked closer, I noticed a distinct, frantic stress radiating around his eyes. He didn't offer a single apology. He didn't ask how I was surviving. He opened the conversation by weaponizing the concept of family. "Chloe, come on," he said, trying to chuckle as he leaned against the doorframe. Dad was under an incredible amount of professional pressure that night. Birthdays make people highly emotional. You completely blew things out of proportion by taking it so personally. Then, without missing a single beat, he seamlessly pivoted into the real, desperate reason he had driven 11 hours down the eastern seaboard. A massive commercial real estate syndication deal he had secretly leveraged had completely imploded. He was facing an immediate, catastrophic margin call from his bank. He needed money fast. "Just a temporary bridge loan," he whispered, his eyes darting around my beautiful entryway. "Just a quick sibling accommodation to smooth things over." I looked at him, completely unmoved, and asked, "Julian, did you drive 11 hours to actually apologize for your cruelty? Or did you drive 11 hours to collect a check?" His face instantly hardened. He immediately began weaponizing standard manipulation tactics, talking aggressively about shared bloodlines, family history, and deep-rooted structural loyalty. It was the exact lexicon that toxic people deploy whenever they want total access to your resources without holding themselves accountable for the damage they caused. Before I could even formulate a response, my phone began ringing loudly. It was Sophia, my strategic partner, on speakerphone because I had been analyzing a major contract expansion at my desk all morning. Julian stood there entirely frozen, as he listened to me calmly negotiate and finalize the operational terms of a massive, 7-figure national licensing agreement, followed by my formal approval of a multi-state warehouse expansion project. I didn't lower the volume. I didn't send the call to voicemail. I absolutely refused to perform artificial modesty for his comfort ever again. When I hung up the phone, Julian was staring at me as if he had just encountered an absolute stranger wearing his sister's face. I looked at him and said, "No. And I don't mean no for now, Julian. I mean a permanent absolute no. No loans, no financial rescues, no emergency bridges. No more private funding from me for people who publicly degrade my character and then privately rely on my silence to sustain their lifestyles." His face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. "Dad was completely right about you," he spat. "Success has made you entirely selfish and cold." "Success didn't change me, Julian," I responded calmly. "It simply made it completely impossible for people like you to continue pretending that I owe you everything while deserving absolutely nothing from you in return." He left my property furious, profoundly humiliated, and far more shaken than his ego wanted me to see. I later discovered that he drove straight back to Columbus and immediately exposed the entire reality to my parents. He described the historic house, the massive scale of the operation, the sheer volume of the wealth, and the terrifying fact that I possess far more economic power than they had ever dreamed possible. That single conversation was the very first structural crack in the myth they had spent 15 years carefully constructing about me. And it marked the formal beginning of their consequences. A month later, the city of Savannah made me visible in a way my hometown had spent my entire life actively suppressing. A prominent regional business journal ran an extensive front-page cover feature detailing my workshops, my logistics firm's explosive national growth, and the highly unconventional, uncredentialed route I had taken to build a modern empire. The piece was incredibly sharp, beautifully written, and deeply honest. The journalist explicitly noted how the most brilliant, innovative modern founders are frequently dismissed and gaslit by the people closest to them, because their genius doesn't arrive packaged in traditional institutional credentials. The article explicitly mentioned, without naming specific names, that family skepticism often functions as a calculated form of sabotage when personal pride matters more than objective perception. The feature went viral. It was picked up by a massive national business publication. A highly influential entrepreneurship podcast clipped my audio interview. A prominent global venture newsletter quoted my exact words. The people who claim to love you are not always the people who possess the capacity to truly see you. By the second week, the cultural narrative had circled right back into the local business circles of Columbus, Ohio. Suddenly, high school classmates who had ignored me for a decade were inundating my inbox with messages. Distant relatives began frantically liking my corporate announcements. And my immediate family, who had spent years treating my career path like a shameful family secret, found themselves standing completely exposed in the middle of a national public narrative they possessed absolutely zero power to control. The fallout dismantled each of them with surgical precision. My father's legacy engineering firm had spent the last year publicly branding themselves as champions of modern innovation and future non-traditional talent. After my national article spread like wildfire through their corporate offices, Arthur's coworkers and senior partners began forwarding the feature around the executive suites, leaving loud comments about how staggering it was that someone from the Vance family had engineered a multi-million-dollar logistics empire completely from scratch without a university degree. Senior executives who had listened to my father lecture for decades about traditional paths began asking him, half joking and half not, whether he still genuinely believed a college degree was the sole metric of human capability. My father reacted the way all proud, insecure men do when objective truth publicly embarrasses them. He got intensely louder before he got smaller. He snapped aggressively at a young female project manager during an executive meeting, because she openly praised non-traditional operational hiring strategies. He completely lost his temper in the corporate cafeteria when a senior partner brought up my national podcast interview. Within 2 months, due to the immense internal embarrassment and a subsequent stress-induced medical leave, he was quietly advised by the board to take an early, accelerated retirement package. Everyone in the Columbus business community understood the unspoken reality. It was a forced resignation wrapped in a nicer suit. Julian's consequences were far more devastating to his immediate career. It was discovered that he had been aggressively leveraging my name and my logistics firm's national reputation at his bank, explicitly hinting to high-value clients and senior supervisors that he possessed exclusive, back-channel executive access to my enterprise and could seamlessly secure our commercial banking portfolio the moment he was promoted into a senior vice president role. The moment my national feature made it undeniably obvious that we were completely estranged, and that he had completely fabricated those executive connections, corporate compliance launched an immediate investigation. He was instantly stripped of his promotion track, formally written up for corporate misrepresentation, and demoted to a minor portfolio. The story traveled faster than his ego could manage, and relatives who had spent decades treating him like the golden intellectual son suddenly stopped answering his calls when he pitched them side ventures. Clara took the first genuine step toward actual adulthood. She sent me a long, uninterrupted voice note. It wasn't a calculated public performance, and it wasn't a half apology buried under defensive excuses. "Chloe," her voice trembled through the phone, "I knew Dad was entirely wrong that night. And I stayed completely silent solely because I was terrified that if I stood up for you, he would turn his rage on me next. I am deeply ashamed of my cowardice. You deserved a sister, and I chose to act like a safe spectator. I listened to that voice note 3 times in total. Sincerity had become such a rare commodity in my life that I literally needed to hear it multiple times to trust its structural integrity. And then came the twist that felt so intensely fictional I refused to believe it until the formal corporate invitation landed directly in my executive email inbox. The massive industrial firm where my father had dedicated 35 years of his life was hosting their annual regional summit on manufacturing innovation and workforce futures. A newly appointed 30-something director had read my national feature, deeply researched my logistics software infrastructure, and formally invited me to deliver the center stage keynote address on building high-growth systems completely outside traditional educational pathways. The title they proposed made me laugh out loud alone in my Savannah kitchen. Success beyond the credential. My father would not merely hear about it. He would be structurally forced to watch the very institution he worshipped celebrate the exact daughter he had thrown out of his home as uneducated trash. My mother began calling me immediately after the public announcement. First softly, then frantically, then almost daily. She pleaded that the family desperately needed to heal. She kept making excuses, claiming your father was under immense pressure, that Julian was drowning in debt, that Clara missed me terribly, and that things had simply gotten entirely out of hand. But she never once led her conversations with what actually mattered, a fundamental acknowledgement of the core abuse. Not until I completely stopped answering her calls altogether. Then the definitive text message finally arrived on my phone. Your father admits he was wrong. Not sorry that he had shattered his daughter's heart. Not sorry for the decades of systemic humiliation. He was wrong. The word arrived incredibly late, driven entirely by the public collapse of his own reputation, but it had finally arrived. I texted her back a cold, unshakable boundary. There will be no private resets. There will be no cozy family dinner where everyone uses softer voices and calls it accountability. If any of you desire any form of relationship with me moving forward, you will tell the truth plainly and publicly, first to yourselves, and then to the people you have actively misled. My mother agreed to the terms almost instantly. That rapid compliance told me exactly how desperate they had become to salvage their social standing. I formally accepted the keynote invitation. I booked my flight back to Columbus. And for the absolute first time in my 32 years of life, I was not returning to that city to prove my worth to anyone. I was returning because the objective truth had finally grown so structurally massive that no one in that family could ever make it kneel again. The summit took place inside a highly polished, multi-million-dollar downtown convention hall. Massive banners bearing legacy corporate logos hung majestically from the vaulted ceilings like old men constantly reminding one another that they still ruled the world. When I arrived backstage, Clara was already waiting for me. She was dressed in a sharp navy corporate suit, but she looked infinitely less certain of herself than I had ever seen her. She reached out and hugged me once. I permitted it, but I didn't sink into it. She stepped back immediately, as if she was fully aware that she had not yet earned the right to comfort me. She quietly informed me that Julian was on the verge of losing his position at the bank, that our father hadn't left the house since his forced retirement, and that our mother had spent weeks frantically calling relatives to dismantle the false, toxic narrative they had spent years curating about my life. Then Clara silently handed me her phone. "You should see this before you walk out there," she whispered. The screen displayed a recorded video copy of a massive family Zoom call from the previous weekend. A call containing my aunts, uncles, cousins, and older family friends who had quietly absorbed my parents' toxic version of me for over a decade. In the clear recording, my mother openly stood up and confessed to the entire extended family that they had judged my path completely unfairly, systematically minimized my brilliant work, and allowed my father's unchecked ego to manifest as pure psychological cruelty. Then my father, looking incredibly frail, stiff, and visibly miserable, stood before the camera and uttered the exact words I once thought I would die to hear. He explicitly stated that he had severely insulted and cast out the very daughter who had privately supported their financial survival more than any of them would ever know. He stated that he had fatally confused an institutional credential with actual human worth. He stated, before everyone he respected, that he was entirely wrong. It wasn't a beautifully elegant speech. It wasn't deeply redemptive. And it certainly didn't possess the magical power to erase 15 years of emotional trauma. But it was completely public and it was undeniably real. I handed Clara's phone back to her. "Thank you for making them execute that without me in the room," I said quietly. That was the first definitive boundary I had set, and for the first time no one dared to test its limits. The moment I stepped out onto that massive auditorium stage under the blinding glare of the spotlights, my eyes locked onto them immediately. Arthur Vance was sitting in the center of the front section. His shoulders were squared entirely too hard. His face locked into the rigid expression of a man caught in an agonizing vice between profound shame and stubborn engineering pride. Julian sat directly beside our mother, looking drastically smaller and deflated, as if the protective cushion of his unearned privilege had finally vanished. Clara took her seat near the edge of the aisle. The corporate moderator's voice boomed through the high-end sound system, introducing me as a visionary industrial founder, an elite logistics systems strategist, and a powerful national voice for non-traditional economic enterprise. The introduction listed my job creation metrics, my multi-million-dollar corporate impact, and my work in completely redefining the architecture of modern commercial credibility. My father didn't clap at first, but as the thunderous applause of hundreds of elite executives and operators erupted all around him, the sheer social force of the room dragged his hands together, forcing him to applaud his outcast daughter almost entirely against his will. I stood at the polished podium and scanned the crowded room. I had written a highly technical, completely safe speech during my flight. I abandoned more than half of it within the very first minute. I looked into the audience and told them that profound operational talent does not always arrive carrying the institutional paperwork we have been trained to expect. I told them that some of the most extraordinarily capable operators in the United States are systematically dismissed and crushed early in life simply because their genius does not conform to a social script originally designed by fear. I stated that credentials certainly possess value, training matters, and structural discipline is essential, but none of those metrics mean a single thing if they are weaponized as an excuse to deny basic human dignity to people whose path looks entirely different. Then I delivered the definitive line that caused the entire convention hall to go completely breathlessly still. A person's true capability and value are always revealed long before their resume possesses the power to impress you. The ultimate test of your character is how you treat an individual before you discover exactly what they can do for your lifestyle. I didn't look directly at my father when the words left my mouth. I didn't need to. The suffocating silence crashing around his seat answered for me. By the time I delivered my concluding remarks, the entire audience was standing on their feet. The standing ovation rattled the glass walls of the convention hall. It wasn't a victory because I had won some petty game of revenge. It was a victory because objective truth, when spoken with total clarity and zero apology, possesses a physical, undeniable weight. It fundamentally alters the temperature of any room it occupies. Following the main presentation, the senior corporate director who had originally invited me orchestrated a meeting. With a polite, upper-crust corporate cruelty that almost qualified as high art, he turned to my father, smiled warmly, and said, "Arthur, you must be incredibly, profoundly proud of your daughter." That was the exact moment Richard Vance completely broke. It wasn't a loud, dramatic physical collapse. It was something infinitely sadder. His entire facial structure seemed to lose its architecture. His posture collapsed and his engineering voice went incredibly thin. He quietly asked if we could step away to speak privately. We walked into a secluded corporate corridor away from the dispersing crowd, though we remained close enough to the exit that he could not retreat into his standard delusions. My mother followed closely behind. Julian hung back near the entrance. Clara stood quietly against the concrete wall, completely content to let the silence execute its necessary work. My father began speaking, desperately relying on the standard, hollow phrases that people always grasp for when they realize they are decades too late. "I was under a crushing amount of operational pressure, Chloe. I didn't know how to process your choices. I was completely shocked." Then he stopped mid-sentence. Even his own ego could hear how pathetic and microscopic those corporate excuses sounded after everything that had transpired. He took a deep breath, looked down at his shoes, and finally uttered the raw truth. "I was intensely cruel to you, Chloe, because your independent success made my entire life sacrifice feel completely unnecessary." It was the very first honest, uncurated statement he had ever spoken to me in my entire 32 years. I looked at him calmly and said, "Dad, your apology matters infinitely less than what it actually reveals. I want you to understand something clearly. I did not suddenly become a valuable human being today because a room full of wealthy corporate strangers stood up and applauded my name. I was exceptionally valuable the exact night you stood at your dinner table and called me trash. I was valuable at 19 when I was bleeding out my youth in that freezing apartment above the loud laundromat. And I was valuable every single time I quietly deployed my capital to rescue your finances without your knowledge." He began to weep then, quiet, heavy tears, but I felt absolutely zero internal desire to step forward and comfort his guilt. Julian spoke next, his voice completely unstable. He openly confessed that he had constructed more than half of his personal identity by feeling intellectually superior to me, and the exact moment my independent reality dismantled that illusion, he desperately tried to borrow my success the exact same way he had borrowed my money. Clara apologized once more, openly, in front of everyone. My mother quietly whispered that she had spent her entire existence purchasing peace from dominant men by constantly sacrificing the inconvenient truth, and that it had ultimately cost her a daughter. I stood there and listened to them. I believed the sincerity of certain parts of their confessions, but I absolutely refused to reward them with cheap, emotional absolution. I looked at them all and explicitly detailed the parameters of our future. The only relationship I am willing to sustain with this family moving forward is a highly limited, strictly bound interaction constructed exclusively on absolute respect, total honesty, and profound physical distance. There will be zero financial connectivity. There will be absolutely zero family access to my enterprise. There will be no emotional rewriting of history after the fact, no unannounced surprise visits to Savannah, and no one calling me selfish for protecting my boundaries. Claire may call my office. Mom may text my personal phone. Julian will require years of consistent behavioral change before I ever consider upgrading our interaction beyond basic civility. I turned my eyes directly to my father. "And you and I, Dad, will never pretend. If you ever wish to speak to me again, you will do it completely stripped of your authority, entirely stripped of your entitlement, and without a single expectation that I am ever going to ease the weight of your guilt." He slowly nodded his head, like a man desperately trying to learn the syntax of a foreign language far too late in life to ever sound natural speaking it. And that was it. There was no cinematic orchestral family reunion. There was no miraculous, overnight emotional healing. There were simply real-world consequences, ironclad boundaries, and a massive blinding truth that none of them could ever force back into the box. I boarded a flight back to Savannah early the following morning. Home. The word finally possessed a concrete definition. It meant a physical geographic space that I had consciously chosen and constructed, not a toxic room where my basic human worth was constantly being evaluated by people who were terrified of my light. A week later, I hosted another operational workshop inside my downtown brick studio. A fresh cohort of independent women arrived, carrying their product samples, physical notebooks, heavy imposter syndrome, raw ambition, and unexecuted business plans. Cooper slept peacefully near the large front glass door while I spent hours teaching unit economics, scaling logistics, founder psychology, and exactly why toxic shame is the most expensive liability an entrepreneur can ever choose to carry on their balance sheet. I significantly expanded the private scholarship endowment fund I had quietly founded the year prior for students building independent ventures outside traditional institutional paths. Clara officially began volunteering her corporate legal hours to help structure our scholarship framework. Julian sent his very first handwritten letter of accountability, a letter that notably contained no requests for financial bridges. My mother mailed a heavy box to my cottage containing all of my old childhood photographs, accompanied by a brief note that simply read, "You were never the problem, Chloe." My father writes exactly once a month. His letters are brief, concise, and entirely stripped of self-pity. They contain nothing but cold facts, personal updates, and the awkward, stumbling effort of a proud man who has finally processed the ultimate lesson of his life: that love can never survive systemic humiliation. Sometimes I choose to open and answer his letters. Sometimes I leave them resting in the mailbox. The profound beauty of my life is that the choice now belongs entirely to me. One evening, months later, I stood completely barefoot on the weathered wooden steps of my Savannah cottage, watching the coastal tide gradually darken under the fading violet light of the southern sky. The entire house behind me was completely silent, save for the gentle rhythmic breathing of Cooper sleeping nearby and the distant, faint echo of laughter drifting from neighbors down the lane. I leaned against the railing and thought back to that chaotic birthday dinner in Columbus. I thought about the younger version of me, the girl who walked out into the cold night simply saying, "Okay, fine." I realized she didn't walk away because she was weak. She walked away because she understood that engaging in a screaming argument would only make her smaller in a room that was entirely committed to misunderstanding her. I used to carry the childish belief that true revenge meant finding a way to make the people who hurt you suffer the exact same flavor of agony they inflicted upon you. I know infinitely better now. The ultimate revenge is choosing to let the absolute truth stand perfectly still long enough for them to be forced to see their own reflection within it. The ultimate revenge is dedicating your energy to constructing a life so profoundly solid, so entirely authentic, that their approval or disapproval becomes completely irrelevant to your survival. The ultimate revenge is reaching a state of consciousness where, when they finally come searching for your value, you no longer require their validation to confirm it. I looked out across the darkening water and felt a wave of peace settle into my bones, a tranquility I had never once experienced within the city limits of Columbus. I didn't need my family to rescue me, I didn't need them to validate my empire, and I didn't need them to finally choose me correctly. I had already executed the most critical, terrifying step of the entire journey all by myself. I had chosen me first. What happens in your life when you finally possess the courage to place your human worth entirely above bloodlines, toxic guilt, and ancient family roles designed solely to keep you small? Have you ever been branded a complete failure by the very people who were secretly benefiting from your internal strength? Tell me your thoughts in the comments section below, because I read every single one of them. We truly appreciate your support and your time tonight. This narrative is entirely fictional and created for storytelling, entertainment, and educational reflection. May this lesson serve as an unshakable reminder. Being kind is an extraordinary strength, but choosing to remain in spaces where your kindness is systemically abused is a debt you never owe to anyone.